Hey, Craig.
Hey Simon, what do you have for me today?
So I am here to convince you by the end of this episode that you know how like Netflix is considered to be this hugely disruptive force in Hollywood, is completely like upended this super lucrative cable bundle and has also like threatened theatrical releases of movies because it basically goes straight to streaming and is basically hated by like all of Hollywood as a result.
Yeah.
So I am here to argue that HBO in its day was much more disruptive than Netflix ever was. It basically changed the entire paradigm for not only how we watch TV, but also how we watch movies. It invented entire industries from scratch, or at least turned them into the mainstream. And it basically, launched what we consider the modern day prestige TV era.
Okay.
All right,
I
you
am
on board?
excited for you to make this argument because I know almost nothing about the history of HBO. So yeah, I'm on board, but you have to convince me.
Awesome. So before we jump into it, how much do you are like over the past like 15 to 20 years or so? What's your relationship been with HBO?
I have not had an HBO subscription that I know of for a very long time. I know we had it growing up.
Well, before we get
Uh,
to growing up, but
yeah.
just over the like in your adult life, did you ever watch any? Even if you didn't have a subscription, did you watch any shows with like that were like on DVD or like at friend's
Yeah.
house or anything like that?
Yeah. So I watched most of The Sopranos, and then I watched all the Game of Thrones actually because my nephew shared his HBO account with me, so I was able to watch it that way.
Yeah.
And that's really about the extent of my kind of HBO viewing over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Yeah.
Wow, only two shows. Okay, but
Mhm.
you've known it primarily over the last 20 years as kind of like this delivery of prestige narrative serialized TV, basically,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
especially with Game of Thrones, like incredibly high budget special effects
Mhm.
type of TV.
Yeah.
And
Kind of
so
like
you
the
mentioned,
pinnacle of what could be done with like huge budget and like top name actors. And yeah.
yeah, and even luring like traditional like movie actors who would never be caught dead in a TV show, like
Yeah.
actually signing on for like limited series and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So when you think back to your childhood, what was HBO to you?
It was a way to see boobs.
Yeah. Okay.
So we had HBO and we had Cinemax, and they were both useful in their own ways for that. But I don't remember it. Yeah, just when I associate like tween Craig with HBO, it was the channel that showed boobs. I don't recall it like having that sort of like premiere programming until I do remember they had this like big budget TV show about the Apollo landings, like about exploring the moon. That was in like the late '90s, I want to say, and that would like made a bunch of news because it was like this super expensive miniseries, and it was produced by Tom Hanks, and it was after Apollo 13, I think. And
It,
so,
it was like a
um,
documentary series.
no, it was like a live action series. It was called like I think it was called From the Earth to the Moon, and it was about like all the Apollo missions, right?
Yeah. Well,
But yeah,
did
I
you
don't remember it. Sort of like I couldn't name any shows from HBO from when I was growing up.
but that's
I
probably
just remember,
because there weren't many
yeah.
shows back then. Like it was mainly a place you watched movies, I'm assuming. Like
Oh
it
yeah,
was
home
a
box office. That makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's when we think back to our childhoods growing up in the 80s and 90s.
Hmm.
And I don't think we ever subscribed to HBO, but sometimes they would have like free weekends where they would like promo it, where it would be completely free. And
Hmm.
so it was always
Yeah.
great to be able to watch like movies for free without advertising. And that was the other thing,
Yeah.
right? Was there were no commercials on HBO. And also there were, if you were a teenage boy back then, pornography was not easy to come by, so
It
it
was
was,
not.
if you were watching HBO at late at night, you could see boobs or some other nudity
Hmm.
or sexual content and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I
um,
remember like after midnight they would occasionally show. I mean, basically like softcore, right? Because it was very much kind of like had I don't know. In my kind of memory, it had like a seedier connotation than it does now.
yeah, well,
Um,
especially Cinemax, which is owned by the same
mhm.
company.
Yeah.
The nickname was actually Skinemax because of the
Yeah. Yeah.
software.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So, and then do you know anything about, like, when you think about, like, why did the cable industry start? Why do you think cable television came around?
I mean, I assume it was taking advantage of a new technology to deliver stuff directly to people on like a subscription basis, or maybe a reaction to like network sensors. I mean, I know, prior to cable, what it was sort of like, it was like NBC, ABC, CBS, and like network TV had like a stranglehold on things, and there were things you could say and couldn't say and show and couldn't show, and so I just assumed somebody saw an opportunity from like a business perspective of, here's this technology that's literally a cable, and I don't know what is inside of the cable. I'm assuming it's just HBO, and then a way to deliver boobs to people on a subscription basis.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's not right, but I'll tell you what is right.
Okay.
But before we get into that, what's the name of this show?
Momentary Experts is the name of the show.
And you can get it wherever you find your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, and then you can also find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay, let's strap in. So the first thing we got to talk about before we start talking about HBO is the history of the cable industry, because there's really, like, it's not a coincidence that HBO launched exactly when it did. Is because there was, like, the right, like, set of circumstances that came together that made it possible. So as you kind of hinted, for most of television's existence up until like the mid 20th century, there were only really three television channels, like NBC, CBS, and ABC, and that's because television was uh, delivered via broadcast. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty, but broadcast happens on a spectrum. And because you can't have too much crowded spectrum, or else, like, it would just cause like fuzziness and not a very clear signal, the FCC strictly regulated spectrum so that there was only enough spectrum available for three television shows. Does that sort of make sense to you?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Um,
if
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And because the FCC was regulated, those were considered public airwaves. They were owned by the public. They couldn't be privately owned. And basically, the FCC licenses that spectrum out. So it licenses out to these broadcast channels. There's different kinds of spectrum that's given to radios. So, like, all like
Hmm.
radio broadcasts are also strictly regulated by the FCC. And then today, modern, like, cell phones and stuff like that, like AT&T has its own spectrum, Verizon has its own spectrum, and that spectrum is limited. And then there's satellite spectrum, there's GPS spectrum, and I don't know the physics of it, but they're at different wavelengths. So they're at different wave frequencies. And that's what allows them to coexist. And if you crowd out somebody else's spectrum, then you can't get a clear signal. And so that's why it has to step in and regulate it, right? Does that sort of make sense?
So were they regulated like a public utility almost then, since they're like sort of like owned collectively?
Yes, it was like a public
Okay.
utility, and that's why the FCC was able to set strict guidelines about what could show up on your television.
Hmm.
So, you obviously you couldn't have nudity, you couldn't have profanity. Also, because it was delivered by airwaves, there was no way to charge money for it, so it was completely, advertising supported. So everything had to be like very family friendly, because advertisers did not want to appear by any next to anything that was risque or considered brand unsafe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the modern cable industry came about not to give people more choice. It was all just basically just logistics. So starting in the night, there were areas of the US that could not get broadcast signals. What kind of areas are those, do you think?
I'm just assuming places with like poor infrastructure. I don't know, the middle of the desert in the
Yeah,
mountains.
but yeah, mountains, anything that that basically could block a signal.
Okay.
So if you were like in some kind of mountainous area, and then also
Yeah.
in cities, so like large skyscrapers would break up,
Oh wow. Okay.
broadcast signals. So the modern, or the early cable ecosystem came about basically to service that small number of Americans who could not get a clear signal. So there would be a broadcast coming into an antenna, and then the actual the TV shows and stuff were then go through like cable lines to individual people's houses.
That's such a weird thought to have in my head. Like, oh, I can't get good TV reception. I live in too big of a city.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
And yeah,
But if it's like a thing that's actually traveling through the air and then it's getting, yeah, I know so little about the technologies that we depend on every day.
and we think of, today we think of like cable being very consolidated through like
Hmm.
Comcast and
Yeah,
Time Warner and stuff like that. But for like the first like several decades of cable's existence, it was basically just dozens and dozens and dozens of these individual local cable operators that were receiving the broadcast and then had local customers and stuff like that. And in fact, I remember as a kid, like there was no ubiquitous cable system. It wasn't until
hmm.
later consolidation came around to where they started, building like massive customer bases and stuff like that.
So when did the first cable service start then? Because you said like in the first decades plural. So how long ago are we talking?
The late 1940s, early 1950s.
You're shitting me. Seriously?
No, yeah, seriously. But like
There
I
was
said,
cable service.
yeah, but it was nothing like you think of cable today. It was
Yeah.
basically the three broadcast channels, but it was just being delivered to you in a slightly different way.
Okay. Yeah. Still, that's like I don't know. That's like slightly brain breaking for me. Okay.
Yeah. So for the first 20 years of cable's existence, there was enormous potential because they were beaming these through lines anyway. They could add extra channels on top of the three channels, but they didn't because at that point the FCC was still strictly regulating these cable systems so that they could really only, broadcast the three major broadcasts that had spectrum. It
Yeah.
wasn't until the early 1970s that the FCC deregulated the cable industry, that suddenly these cable companies were able to start building channels on top of the three broadcasts. But because it was so fragmented, in like the first year or two, like it was just like they were developing their own channels, but it was like local cable access channels. It wasn't like there was some kind of, it wasn't like, today, like Nickelodeon or MTV or anything like that, because like each little tiny cable distributor was distributing, their own TV shows and stuff like that.
Okay. Okay.
So, early 1970s, they deregulate the cable industry, and lo and behold, that's when HBO first launches. It launches in 1972. I think in like New York or Pennsylvania, there was a kind of entrepreneur who convinced Time Inc., which was a massive media magazine company at that point, to give him a $150,000 grant to basically launch this cable network that it could charge money for on top of whatever the cable distributors were charging for basic access to, these broadcast channels. It was originally called the Green
Okay.
Channel, but then they renamed it to HBO. And the idea was so revolutionary at the time. This was pre widespread adoption of the VCR. If you
Hmm.
wanted to watch movies back in the early 70s, you basically had to go to movie theaters. Like that was the only way to consume movies. And then maybe at some later date they might be syndicated on like a broadcast channel like NBC or something like that. Obviously very heavily edited for advertising breaks and everything like that. But there was no Blockbuster, there was no video rental, there was no way to like buy, recordings of movies. So it was completely revolutionary idea that um, that entire movies could be broadcast over this cable system. And then the other part that made it revolutionary was that it wasn't hampered by that regulation, the FCC regulation, because it wasn't going out over public broadcast airwaves. The FCC had no say in what could be broadcast. So that
Mm,
opened the window for the first time for things like profanity and nudity and graphic violence to show up and be beamed to your television.
yeah.
And on top of that, it was because they were charging a fee that was in addition to what you were paying for basic cable. They did not have any advertising, so there were no advertisers to offend by graphic content, by violence and nudity.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's so jarring now, and I think probably a lot of people listening to this too might not have really experienced much in the way of like TV when ads were still commonplace. But yeah, that was just, every 10 minutes there was a commercial break. And then, there was, when you tried to like record something at home, it was trying to like turn off the recording when the commercial started and then waiting on the record button right when they ended so that you could pick it back up. Right. And it's jarring to me when like I do find myself in a place where I'm watching regular TV again that has the regular
Oh yeah,
ads,
yeah.
and it's just like I don't remember there being this many. I think there always were. It was just we had gotten used to it, right? And so yeah, just the idea of not having any must have seemed so luxurious.
And yeah, and today, like when I go to the only time I'm exposed to cable is when I'm in a hotel.
Hmm.
And like you, I'm like, did we really sit through this many ads? Like it's almost one to one sometimes. Like
Hmm.
for every 5 minutes of screen time, you're also getting 5 minutes of ads. At least when you're like watching a movie over time, once it gets to the end, they know they have you hooked, so they're having more and more ad
Yeah,
breaks, and it's just such a jarring experience.
and it wasn't like we even had like smartphones to stare at while the commercials were on. We just had to watch them. I mean, there was nothing else to do. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, go for a walk?
Yeah, and if you like if you remember the TV shows back then, like I Dream of Genie, I Love Lucy. They were very saccharine and like
Hmm.
and they weren't offensive at all. Like if you remember, like Lucy and Desi, they didn't even sleep in the same bed. They had separate beds. Like it was
Yeah,
just like a
yeah.
completely different like outlook on life. And then suddenly you had this ability that people never had before, which is to watch full length movies in their home without commercials. And those movies were like completely uncensored.
Yeah. Okay.
So obviously that was very revolutionary in its time. It became hugely popular, and it was actually like hated by the movie studios because like they if you can already start to draw some parallels between HBO back then and Netflix today is like I said back then, if you wanted to watch a movie you had to go to a theater, and a theater, theater going is much more profitable for movie companies because you have to buy individual tickets that today costs like $15 to $20, and whatever
Hmm.
inflation adjusted it was back then, it was much more lucrative because it was bought on an a la carte basis. Now suddenly you could pay this one monthly fee and get like basically unlimited movies all around the clock by watching HBO. And very early on, the movie studios felt very threatened by this and did not. They had like a very uneasy relationship with HBO as a result.
Yeah,
They were
well, yeah, like I know that in like the 60s, I think was when they started, but like the then also novel concept of like the network, like the made for TV movie, right? Like you don't need to go out this weekend. You can stay in and watch a movie. It's going to suck, right? But it was a way to like to do it cheaply. So yeah, probably the studios were never that threatened by them because they were just mostly garbage and you couldn't really attract like marquee movie stars to do them. But yeah, here if they're actually allowing people to suddenly not have to leave the house, and again, it's something that we take for granted in the era of like I can just turn on my TV and I pretty much have access to the majority of movies, like anything I'm feeling like, right? But to live kind of in a world where your only options were to catch it in the theater if you could, then to suddenly have like be able to stay home, yeah, just like absolutely revolutionary.
Yeah, and back then, obviously, theatrical runtimes were much longer because of that,
Hmm.
because there
Yeah,
was that scarcity, and that if you wanted to watch a movie, you had to see it in the theaters. So the movies could stay in theaters for much longer than they do today. Whereas there are a lot of movies today that barely last like a few weeks in the theaters because
yeah.
there just isn't enough demand for them because of the abundance of content that we have access to today.
So was there any attempt by the studios to like say like to limit HBO's access to movies then? Like if they're sort of threatened by them and if they presumably owe like still own like the distribution rights or was like HBO taking advantage of like existing kind of contracts that like these companies had with the studios or
Well, it's kind of you think about like the modern day analog of Netflix is like the studios always considered it a threat from very on, but it became
Yeah.
such a powerful force that it was giving them so much money, especially in the wake of the Great Recession, which is when Netflix really ramped up its streaming operations. That was
Yeah.
just like free money coming into their coffers, and they couldn't turn it
Mm,
away at first. And
yeah.
then like Netflix accrued so much power so quickly. Like if you look at its like chart of growth, and it was within a few years was spending billions of dollars, and like all the movie studios and even the television networks got like very addicted to that money
Hmm.
very early on. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but yeah, the same kind of thing happened with HBO. But the movie studios were so threatened that they actually teamed up to launch a HBO competitor, which was a cable channel called Premiere. And basically they would have been able to do what you're saying is basically bypass HBO and go direct to the consumer. And then why would they need to go through HBO anymore? They just
Hmm.
could get all their customers on a $15 a month subscription and deliver movies to them. So that would have completely basically destroyed HBO. And the only thing that saved it was a DOJ lawsuit for antitrust. So basically, the Department of Justice stepped in and successfully sued those movie studios and got them to basically disband Premiere and said, you can't do this because this is basically price fixing and anti competitive behavior.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because if then they also owned the only outlet to getting them to TV, then they control the entire market. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a lot of those other kind of regulations that like those old school regulations that a a local radio station couldn't also own a local newspaper because
Hmm.
it would just control too much of the market. So there are lots of old school media regulations like that, and this was
Yeah.
considered in violation of that ethos. So that allowed HBO to continue to grow unfettered, and eventually it like got enough market power that it could get these super advantageous distribution rights with studios where it could get like exclusive rights to broadcast like brand new movies that were just out of theaters, like only for like the theatrical run would end, and then HBO would be able to broadcast it exclusively a few weeks later. And part of the way that it was able to get those distribution rights is it would negotiate them in advance before the movies even hit the theaters. And so then how did it know how much it was going to have to pay for the distribution rights? It was going to be based on whatever the number was tied to the box office numbers of whatever the movie was.
Okay.
So if the movie had made a certain amount in the theaters, then that would trigger an amount that HBO would have to pay for the broadcasting rights, which wouldn't be a
Right.
problem, except there were like some big surprise blockbuster hits where HBO had already agreed in advance to license the content, and they weren't expecting it to do as well in the theaters that it did.
Mm.
Like one example was Ghostbusters. Like Ghostbusters was not expected to be a huge hit, but it ended up being like a huge blockbuster. And the executives at HBO were like watching in horror as the box numbers racked up because they realized that it was going to be a massive payday that was going to almost bankrupt HBO because it had agreed in the contract to pay that amount based on the box office, you know,
And they couldn't
earning.
just like back out of broadcasting it, like they had signed a contract to also broadcast it at this price of like a percentage of the box office. Oh wow.
Yep,
Okay.
that's how they got those super advantageous turns, but that locked them in to
Yeah.
whatever the pricing was. So that was like a huge threat to HBO's business model was these like surprise blockbusters that they weren't
Yeah.
expecting to do so well.
Okay.
So eventually, like some competitors came on to the market. There was Showtime. There was also something called the Movie Channel, and
I remember that.
yeah, and so HBO started to get more competition. There was also in the 80s, obviously the VCRs became more widespread. We started to see the early rise of movie rentals and movie purchases and stuff like that. So suddenly it wasn't so novel to be able to, sit down at your home and watch a full length unedited movie.
Hmm.
So that put HBO under threat. Obviously, its business model under threat. So that's when it started to dip its toes into original content. And the early things that it focused on like completely revolutionized those like entertainment mediums that it was focused on. So like one of them was stand-up comedy. Prior to HBO like starting these like stand-up comedy specials, stand-up comics like their only way of reaching audiences that were outside of a club was one through the sale of comedy albums, like vinyl comedy albums where you would like
Oh,
go and
right.
buy and then listen to it. And then maybe if you were extremely lucky, you could get like a 5 minute set on some late night show like Johnny
Hmm.
Carson. But of course, like then because it was on broadcast channel, it had to be, super clean set. There couldn't be any profanity or anything like that. HBO basically built an entire market from scratch for the hour long comedy special.
Okay.
And comics love this obviously because it gave them a national stage, but it also allowed them to be extremely profane, tell dirty jokes, and it really allowed them to be more creative in their stand up and also to build like hugely successful careers because before they were completely reliant on, going from, the different comedy sellers and stuff like that and building an audience like slowly by just like doing stand up in front of live audiences. This allowed them to reach like a very huge audience all at once, which like basically minted all these careers. It built the careers of George Carlin, Chris Rock, Billy Crystal, Robin Williams. It put all these like what we consider now to be A-list stars on the map
Hmm.
because of the invention of the HBO hour-long comedy special.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like comedy specials that I seem to remember watching a lot in the '90s. There was the Chris Rock one where you had like the blue letters behind him on stage the whole time. Was that an HBO special?
Yep, Chris Rock, famous HBO
Okay.
specials. Chris Rock.
Yeah.
There was Dave Chappelle. One of his earliest specials was on
Hmm.
um, uh, George. I mean, again, George Carlin, very famous stand-up comedian. Very like his jokes, like clips, are still circulated on YouTube today. Um, Trying to think, there was another famous comedian in the '90s, but I'm currently blanking. But anyway, yeah. I found this quote. Let's see. Um, when HBO launched in 1972, there were only 10 major comedy clubs in the entire country. Fast forward 10 years later, and there were more than 400, due in large part to HBO's commitment to featuring comics. So it basically like turned stand-up comedy to this kind of niche pursuit to this like mainstream type of entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic idea when you think about it because okay, they want to be able to offer something that still other people aren't, right? That's still also unique to kind of their package, right? So like adult themes, but like if you do a comedy special and you book like a really good stand-up comedian, you don't have to do a lot. You just turn the camera on and then they're funny for an hour.
And it's not like you have to hire a bunch. Even if the comic himself costs a decent amount of money, you don't have to pay other actors. You don't have to. There's not like huge
Hmm.
production or special
Yeah,
effects
it's
or all
just an
those sorts.
auditorium.
Yeah, so it's like it's kind of an inexpensive way to make like original content that's like super entertaining and that audiences would actually want to tune
Yeah.
into. The other industry that it turned mainstream was boxing. Prior to HBO, boxing was mainly consumed at the local level. Like you had to go to a fight, or maybe it was like broadcast on a local channel. But there would be, but like, like again, the cable industry was so fragmented at the time that there was no way to broadcast a live boxing match because it was too violent to be on like the major broadcast
Hmm.
airwaves. There was no way to broadcast like a national fight. And so that's when HBO basically invented the entire satellite business, a technological way to beam a satellite feed of a boxing match to all these cable distributors at once so that no matter where you were, you could watch the fight in real time.
And again, you've got content that's like already there and you don't really have to do much else for. I mean, you've got to like, create some intros and promos and you have to like hire announcers, but the rest of it you're just filming people who were boxing, right? So it's not like you have to like write it or create episodes.
Yeah. And,
Hmm.
like some of the most famous fights that people still talk about today, George Foreman defeating Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, those were broadcast on HBO. HBO basically put Mike Tyson on the map. Like, there was a time when Mike Tyson and HBO were basically synonymous. Mike Tyson played a huge role in the rise of like HBO and vice versa because his fights were just so much in demand, and like HBO would actually do kind of pioneered also like pay per view and would be able to charge like huge exorbitant amounts of money just to watch like a
Hmm.
single Mike Tyson fight. And then the third thing was documentary filmmaking. Like, it's hard to kind of think about it to now, but like back then in the 70s and before then, documentaries were like super niche. They had almost no budgets whatsoever. You could only see them maybe at like film festivals, and then maybe if PBS picked up your documentary, it would get a wider audience. But there was not like a national audience for documentaries at the time. And like, again, going back to that, what you were talking about, kind of the highly entertaining but low budget fare, where they wouldn't have to, like, HBO wouldn't have to pay as much as like what a broadcast channel would have to pay for like a sitcom or a TV show or something like that. It commissioned a lot of documentaries, and then it also, for that, it leaned into its ability to have sexual content, nudity, and stuff like that. Like, there was this incredible, I don't know if you remember it from a kid, but like when you talk about like sneaking to watch boobies when you were like 14 years old,
Yeah.
there was this series called Real Sex. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah, so that was like a hugely popular documentary series on
Hmm.
HBO.
And then also, there was the taxi cab show.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was all, yeah,
Um,
like Taxi Cab Confessions or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah, and I had forgotten about that. But yeah, kind of like, I don't know, it had vanished down the memory hole. But that was, um, yeah, just kind of like it was like a camera in a cab, like driving around, and then hoping to find drunk adult people talking about sexy things. Again, like not a lot of budget required for that, but um, yeah, still kind of leaning. So yeah, like even more, still leaning into that sort of, what can we offer that other people aren't, so it's still this adult content.
And yeah, and HBO back then was just super scrappy. Like, its executives were very cheap. They did not like taking huge bets on anything, and so it just kind of had to like work with what it had. It didn't have huge budgets, and so it had to basically invent these genres from scratch that didn't cost a lot of money, but were also incredibly popular in order to differentiate itself. From Showtime, from the movie channel, and some of these other things that had access to the same movies that it had.
Okay.
So then you flash forward a few more years, and it can no longer kind of ignore the pool to start like actually funding real shows, real fiction series, because by then, like, obviously there were more cable channels coming online. It wasn't just HBO anymore. It wasn't just Showtime. There was like the rise of TBS, TNT, MTV, Nickelodeon. There was just like a wide range of competition that was starting to come up, and they were part of the cable bundle, so it was kind of differently. They had like what are called carriage fees, which allowed them to make money regardless of whether people were actually watching them. And we don't have to dive into that rabbit hole, but HBO was always an add-on service. It wasn't part of the traditional cable
Mhm.
bundle, and so it needed to create stuff that was so good that people wouldn't be satisfied with the traditional cable bundle, that they wanted to pay that extra money on top of their cable bill in order to access it. And at that point, Blockbuster was ubiquitous. So on the movie front, it really couldn't compete. And you had a much more diverse lineup of television shows, not just on broadcast, but then these burgeoning cable networks, which, because of carriage fees and advertising and stuff like that, were able to
Mhm.
start funding their own shows.
Okay, wow. So, did the rise of the internet and the already universal availability of pornography then also kind of lessen the value add of adult content that HBO had, do you think?
I mean, I would say that was probably much more disruptive of like Playboy and Penthouse than it was,
Yeah.
HBO. None of the research that I saw indicated that the internet was like, at least at that point, was a huge threat to HBO because like but we will talk a little bit about more about like the nudity and profanity and stuff as we talk about these
Yeah, yeah.
shows. But I don't know that the rise of the internet and internet pornography was really that much of a
Or not
disruptive
just
force for
pornography, but
HBO.
like just the ability to sort of like, and I guess we're, well, yeah, we'd be talking about like pre-video streaming and stuff,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
just sort
Video
of
back then
there's,
was really hard to stream.
yeah, just kind of like the ability to even create, yeah, it's sort of like, I don't know, more adult oriented content, but it would have been all text based. So yeah, so like that really wouldn't have been a competitor to like the allure of things like Real Sex or Taxi Cab Confessions. Yeah, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself in like the technology evolution.
Yeah, but really the threat was on the movie side was like Blockbuster, and then on the television side were these up and coming television networks, cable networks and stuff like that, that
Hmm.
because they were on the traditional cable bundle, had large audiences, were also monetized through advertising and could afford, to actually fund like real TV shows and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So starting in the 90s, HBO starts to wade in to actual traditional TV shows. Its early shows, because their executives were so cheap or super low budget, like one of its first kind of critically acclaimed shows was called The Larry Sanders Show. And I actually like went back and because I heard so much hype about how great this show was, I went on HBO Max and like tried to watch some
Hmm.
of it, and it is so low budget, it is almost unwatchable. Like it looks like they are like we're using like a regular video camera or something like that. Like
Yeah.
the sets were incredibly cheap. The video quality was just bad. Apparently, like they couldn't even afford to build a kitchen on the set for Larry Sanders' home. So in the entire run of the series, there's not a single scene that's shot in his kitchen as a result. Like that's how cheap they were.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I have a vague memory of that. And it also kind of, still being that you have like kind of associated with adult content. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It was like for whatever, I mean, like obviously it hasn't stuck around for a reason, right? It's just one of those kind of cultural properties that everyone just kind of forgot about, presumably because of how underwhelming it was.
Yeah. But despite like having extremely low budgets, like HBO was able to lure a lot of like TV's top showrunners of that era because they were just so fed up with the networks and they wanted creative freedom because there was such strict, control over, runtime. You had to write in beats within the show that allowed for a commercial to show every X amount of time.
Mm,
Obviously you couldn't have any profanity, or like there were entire like storylines that they couldn't do because the censors at the network were basically telling them, no, this can't be on television, this can't show in front of advertisers. And so even though HBO at the time wasn't yet a prestige network and had extremely low budgets, you had these like up and coming showrunners like David Chase who could be lured onto creating a show for HBO just because at that point they had basically a hate relationship with all the networks because they were tired of like all these restrictions on them.
so what year are we at roughly? Are we in like the mid 90s yet in this timeline?
We're in the mid to late 90s.
Okay. So
So
not
they
quite yet like premiere TV then obviously.
Yeah, not quite
Yeah.
premiere TV, but
Yeah.
they're starting to
Yeah.
make like more original TV shows. That's probably how they ended up
Yeah.
greenlighting that NASA show you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
But there was this thing like I was reading this biography of HBO a few months back, and like every time a showrunner would turn in a script for an episode, like a lot of the HBO executives in their notes back to them would always ask for quote unquote cable edge, which was code for nudity. And
Okay.
so
Yeah.
if you look at like all the early TV shows, especially like even like looking at Sopranos today, like the amount of like nudity and sex scenes and stuff like that is pretty gratuitous. And it's
Yeah,
because a
just
lot
random. There's some boobs.
Yeah. And there was like a lot of misogyny within the upper ranks of HBO. Like there was like a very famous case of of a high up female executive being like brutally strangled by the I think was like the president of HBO at the time, because he had been dating her and been like flown into a rage, and we nobody even found out about it for decades because they kind of just paid her off and she quietly went away. And there were all sorts of like really like bad reports years later of like rampant misogyny and sexual
Hmm.
harassment and stuff like that in the top ranks of HBO. And as a result of that, or in tandem with that, like a lot of the HBO executives thought HBO was like a male a male oriented network, so they wanted to like really lean into that. Hence why every single notes from top brass back to the showrunners is we need more cable edge.
Yes.
Basically, we need to insert some nudity into this episode. So then so okay, so there were several false starts, some critically acclaimed shows, but like they didn't have like a lot of commercial success. Like obviously like the Larry Sanders Show was kind of a cult favorite, but it was not like any it was nothing compared to like Seinfeld or something like that. What do you think was the first blockbuster show they had?
I'm trying to remember their shows in the 90s, and I intentionally didn't do any research on this just because I knew it was the general topic. I know there was that like Arliss show about like a sports agent, and I remember that. And then like there's The Sopranos, but that started in like 2000.
That was
Was there a
like
blockbuster in between?
yes, Sex in the City.
Oh my god, that was
Sex
an
in the
HBO show? Really? Okay.
Yeah, Sex and the
Okay.
City was not only like a huge blockbuster show that everybody talked about, but then also it kind of disproved this like misogynistic take that only like male viewers would want to watch,
Yeah.
a show on HBO. So it was like hugely successful with female audiences. That was HBO's like first like in like appointment television type of thing where like people would actually like tune in every Sunday or whenever it
Hmm.
actually came on to watch it. Like hugely successful, at least for a premium cable channel like HBO. And then, as you mentioned, The Sopranos was even a bigger show. Like Sopranos really kind of put HBO on the map for the home of being prestige TV.
Yeah.
And really, like if you think of like cape like television when you were a kid, what was it like? Were there any kind of serialized stories?
No, so that's a thing. It's yeah, like now you're used to like any show that you want to watch is pretty much going to tell a story over the course of a season, or maybe the whole show. Like in that Breaking Bad way, where it's literally a 60-hour movie, right? But it was also episodic. There was a story, and it started, and then it ended within the 22 or 24 minutes, or maybe 44 if it was an hour, or sometimes there would be two-part episodes. But
Yeah,
they
and the
didn't
two-part
have these.
episodes were like events. Like it was like
Yeah,
such a huge deal when there was a to be
yeah, it was
continued on a
advertised.
TV show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but yeah, you didn't have this because yeah, like if you missed an episode, there was
yeah,
no
there
way to
was
ever
no
go
way.
back and watch it again until it was released on VHS. But now
But
it's like
but even
yeah,
then, it wasn't
you
in
can't.
the '90s. It wasn't normal for TV shows to be released on VHS. That is
Yeah,
like
but
something
now
that
it's
came
like if
about in the
you
early 2000s.
yeah, it's true. Yeah. But now, yeah, it's like if you try to jump in like midway through a show, you can't because you're just going to be lost because they just pick up where the previous one left off. Um, but yeah, like the way of consuming TV was so radically different in the 90s because well, one, there was like an appointment that you had to keep, like you had to be there, right? And then like I mentioned that like trying to like record it and like not get the commercials, but then yeah, if you missed it then you couldn't really watch it again. So yeah, if they had tried to do this sort of like multi-episode storylines, people would have just gotten lost. Like probably the most you could get away with was like 2 episodes, and they still would start the second one with a last time on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and then have like 5 minutes of explaining the previous episode.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so basically, like HBO and Sopranos caught the early wave of the DVD box set. This idea,
Mhm.
because that was not like it seems obvious now, but it was not the norm for like television shows to release like VHS or DVD box sets of their seasons after they aired. And that was a phenomenon that started in the early 2000s, which coincidentally was right when HBO was ramping up its actual television production. So it basically almost invented from scratch. Like there are some precursors like Twin Peaks and a few others that were shows with like more narrative series, but it basically pioneered the narrative TV, like serialized TV show that's now become ubiquitous, like what we consider
Hmm.
prestige TV today, to be a higher art form compared to network television. Like HBO was the original pioneer with these shows that had these like super complicated season long storylines and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So you had the rise of the DVD box sets, and then you're getting into the 2000s. And because there were like no advertisers, it's not to say that like HBO was immune to ratings, but they were like a little bit more insulated in terms of a show having to be a huge hit right away because they didn't have to like satisfy like advertiser commitments and stuff like that. Whereas like even a moderately successful network show could get canceled very quickly just because there was just such high expectations for how many people that had to watch it in order for it to be profitable. There weren't like those same kind of like strict requirements for HBO shows, so it could make some long-term bets on shows that were like pretty much commercial failures. Like for instance, did you know The Wire was basically like nobody knew that show existed for its entire runtime?
No, but it doesn't surprise me because I never watched it until it was over, right?
Yeah.
And
It
then,
never would it
yeah,
never would it's the greatest, I would argue, the greatest TV show ever to exist. It was never even it did not only did it never win an Emmy, it was never nominated for an Emmy. That's
really,
how obscure it was. Yeah.
just nobody watched it.
Nobody watched it. It was just like
Yeah,
this, like
and there's so many
it had its like
examples.
cult following, like it was
Mhm.
loved by critics, and there were like diehard supporters. Like I think like by like the final season, it had built up a little bit of an audience, but it was not a commercial success at all as it was running.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so many examples from like broadcast TV of like the one season shows that everyone's still salty about, like Freaks and
Freaks
Geeks
and Geeks,
or
yeah.
Firefly or something like that. Just because it didn't have the ratings, so we're done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's this funny anecdote I remember reading years ago about how like David Simon, like somewhere around like the third or fourth season of The Wire, walks into whoever the president of HBO's office was at that time and starts pitching him on. Did you watch The Wire? Are you familiar with the?
Yeah, yeah, but like I said, like I saw it after it was off the air.
Yeah, so like he goes in somewhere around the third or fourth season and starts pitching the HBO president on a spin-off show from The Wire that's called something like The City or something, that like there was the whole subplot with Mayor Carcetti and like him like coming in as mayor in like the second or third season or whatever.
Mhm.
And so David Simon wanted to do a whole spin-off show about the mayor's office in Baltimore. And
Okay.
like there's this great quote, I wish I had dug it up before this, from that HBO executive who was like, "Here I was like barely being able to greenlight new seasons of The Wire, wanting so
Hmm.
badly to cancel it, and David Simon was coming into my office and trying to get me to give him money for another show that was based on this show that nobody watched."
Trust me, the public is hungry for a drama about the Baltimore mayor's office. People are gonna tune in. Like,
So yeah,
yeah,
that's
I
kind
didn't
of.
know that it was like completely obscure when it was on though, because it's one of those that's been like elevated in the public consciousness that I just kind of assumed that it was, like an Emmy darling every year. That's wild.
And if it had aired in the 90s, maybe it would be completely obscure even today because
Mhm.
there wasn't that ability to catch up and watch it on like DVD or whatever.
So, c-
Like I remember watching it on Netflix, like
mhm,
like the Netflix DVDs that were like mailed out.
yeah.
Like I
Oh yeah.
Mira and I watched that together,
So,
having them
what
like.
kind of viewership numbers are we talking about here for HBO? Because this was a thing that I've found myself wondering as you were explaining this. It's sort of like throughout the years, like because obviously you had to subscribe to it. Like how many, like what was their subscriber base? Like how many people were subscribing to the show to HBO like over the years?
So I think like I didn't look at the numbers beforehand, but I just sort of know some offhand numbers, just because I've been covering media for years. Is like I think like at HBO's peak, we're not counting streaming now; we're just counting like cable subscribers. It had maybe like 50 million subscribers, but a successful
Okay.
TV show like Succession is considered a very successful HBO show, and I think like most episodes only had like maybe like 2 million viewers.
Hmm.
So compared to like network television, even like the diminished network television that came later, like, like nowhere near as big as like MASH or like Seinfeld or anything like that, like a successful HBO show was much smaller than, a typical, network show or even basic cable type of show.
Yeah, I just looked it up. Yeah, so 1990 they had 17 million subscribers, like going into the 90s, which yeah, I mean, considering kind of the outsized impact that you've described, this one company having on sort of the history of television and entertainment, as like we think of it now. Like for example, the sort of season long or show long story arc kind of mode. It's yeah, that's not a lot of subscribers, like size wise, to like match in my head to like the impact that HBO has. But I guess when you have just enough money to keep going and you have the right ideas and you can continually come up with these like paradigm shifting kind of innovations, then yeah, you can just kind of have this outsized impact on entertainment.
Yeah. And like you say, like 17 million total subscribers. I mean, I think like the season finale or the series finale of like MASH had like 80 million viewers or something ridiculous like that. Like
I think
just
it
to
was
kind of,
more. I think it was like a majority of the United States watched the season, or yeah, the series finale of MASH, right?
yeah, same thing for like the
Yeah.
series finale of like Seinfeld and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, its user base or it's like its viewership for even its most successful shows, at least other than Game of Thrones, like Game of Thrones became like a legitimate like mainstream success where it would put up numbers that were, you know, similar in size to like major broadcast
Hmm.
numbers, but other than that, most of HBO's like even its most successful shows have not been huge blockbusters compared to like network television.
Yeah. Just as far as size, but yeah, just if you can continue to innovate in an impactful way, even if sort of what you're doing is not reaching a huge amount of people, right? But um, can still have these long term effects on an industry just because of people seeing what you're doing and it being successful. I was remembering as we were talking, and I'm sure that you remember this too. And it's like a great story, I think, as an example of like cultural change. If you wanted to try to explain to somebody how often just bad broadcast TV was, especially like in the 90s. But um, it was, do you remember when it was a mark of intellect to say that you didn't watch television?
Yeah, yeah, when you would
Like,
brag that you didn't do it.
yes, yeah, it was you sort of like, yeah, so like a, yeah, like a, the insufferable kind of like man of intellect that like we all knew like in our like early 20s, but like in the 90s, it would be like, I don't even own a television, right? And then,
I
yeah,
even
it was
remember when
sort
I
of
was
like
in
a,
high school, I went through a period where I remember I stopped watching television. Like I was a bookworm in high school and like television
mhm.
back then just wasn't very good. So I think there was this period of time briefly in when I was in high school when I stopped watching television pretty much completely.
There was even a line in. Do you remember that song from the 90s? It was called Flagpole Sitter or something by this band Harvey Danger. And one of the lines was, "And I don't even own a TV." Right? It was sort of like it even like made it into like
And
song
I don't
lyrics, like,
even
"Oh,
own a
well, then you
TV.
exactly, yeah, yeah." Well, oh, then you must be a person of intellect, and yeah, it was kind of colloquially referred to as the idiot box, and yeah, if you're a person of intellect, then you don't watch television, then you do other things, right? But that's been like completely erased from sort of like our collective consciousness about pop culture, just because of how radically different TV is.
And now, because of the rise of franchise blockbusters basically crowding out all indie movies and kind of small budget movies, TV is now considered like a more prestige art form in some ways than cinema, which classically always had kind of the higher brow association.
Well, yeah, it was kind of except it was like like if you were an actor making it right, then you had like two career paths that you could go on. Everyone tried for movies, right? But if you got into TV, you couldn't really. You just stayed there, right? And then if actors did do a crossover into TV, it was like a late career one, right? It was sort of like after I've done actually sort of acting that matters. Now in middle age, I can cross over into TV.
Or it was like a
But
single
this whole
cameo on
idea,
on a popular show.
yeah, yeah, but you didn't see people bouncing back and forth. You didn't see A-listers bouncing back and forth like, oh, like I'm on a TV show for like one season now and then I'm going to go back to movies. That wasn't a thing that happened. It was like it was automatically assumed to be a step down.
Yeah, and I heard a fact recently. I haven't checked to see if this is true, and I probably could just look at IMDb. But I think I heard that Tom Cruise has never been on a TV show in his entire career because he is like, a classic movie actor, and
Hmm.
like he would never be caught dead on a television show. Same thing with Leonardo DiCaprio. Like he did get his start on like Growing Pains and stuff like that. But I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't think like Leo has ever been on a TV show like post Titanic.
yeah, I can't think of anything, and I also can't think of anything that Tom Cruise would have been in. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Kind of tell this kind of like older view of like the prestige of film versus television.
Yeah, but now it's becoming a lot
Uh,
more common for, especially with limited
yeah.
series where they're not going to be signed on for like 5 seasons. Like it's just like a
Hmm.
single season series. It's much more common for like A-list actors to sign on to do that.
Yeah, and then they can bounce back to movies, and that was just something that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Uh,
One of the most miraculous things about HBO is it like it managed to keep its quality high even though its parent companies were constantly going after into like disastrous merger after disastrous merger. Like there was there was the Warner Communications and Time Inc. They merged in the 80s. That wasn't so bad because that was like a cable company merging with a media company. But do you remember the America Online Time Warner merger?
oh my God, yeah,
It was the biggest
yeah.
merger in history and is now still considered to this day to be the worst merger in history because obviously AOL was floating on a huge bubble that was based entirely on
Hmm.
landlines and like having to log into an AOL account just to access the internet. And
Yeah.
it was like the largest merger in history and was like almost immediately within a few years considered to be among the worst. And Warner Media basically spun out of AOL a few years later. So HBO survived that and remained high quality. Then a few years ago, it was acquired by AT&T, which was like pitching all these synergies that it would like be able to use all this viewership data and then incorporate that into the mobile phone data and then serve up these super targeted ads and stuff like that. None of those synergies happened, and like Warner Media was considered like a huge albatross that AT&T wanted to get rid of.
Hmm.
So then a few years ago, AT&T decides to merge Warner Media with Discovery, which loads Warner Media down with like $50 billion worth of debt.
Okay.
And I don't know how much you follow like entertainment industry news and stuff like that, but like there's been all sorts of disasters as a result of that because they have to like pay down this debt where they're canceling all these already finished movies like Batgirl just so they could get the tax write off. And so like it's just
Hmm.
funny that like the entire HBO's existence, it's been this gem, this like incredible miracle that happened that like disrupted, television and movies and then basically invented prestige TV and continues to this day to put out like amazing critically acclaimed TV shows, and like every single parent company that's ever owned it has been like a complete disaster.
So, how are they doing now, like
I mean,
subscriber
that's where
wise?
the
Because obviously,
so like
like
HBO or
well,
Warner Brothers Discovery, which is the parent company now,
yeah,
just had a really like there are all these companies are struggling now, other than Netflix.
hmm, yeah,
Just had another really bad earnings, like quarterly earnings call that caused its stock price to tank, and it's just because they're just all having like Netflix was so disruptive in destroying the cable bundle, and they all started trying to
hmm,
pivot to streaming, but kind of like the rug was pulled out from under them with the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, and suddenly there was a lot less free money in the market, and Wall Street suddenly started expecting all these companies to start turning a profit, and they were still like losing tons of money on streaming, and so now all of their valuations are in the gutter. In fact, there are now discussions going on to merge Paramount and Warner Brothers Discovery. So basically, it's on the verge of going through another disastrous like merger as a result.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering like how they're doing in terms of like the number of subscribers. Because yeah, like we're back in. I mean, obviously, sort of like the big draw of Netflix, right? Was like you could cut the cord, you could get rid of your cable, and then still have like that experience of watching really most of what you want to watch now. But now it's like the number of streaming services that you need in order to, I get need being a loose word here, but right, like if you subscribe to Hulu Plus without ads, Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Peacock, what the fuck ever, like you end up
Amazon
with as
Prime.
much money as you, yeah, you end up with as much money as you would be spending on like a full cable subscription, right? And so, but also with this many competitors who are also, obviously Netflix has its own studio and they're putting out their own kind of premiere programming, and kind of like how does, I would just wonder like how does HBO pivot from here? Like what can they, like, what could somebody innovate next that's going to be sort of a unique offer that isn't being done to death by a bunch of other people?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I think we're like in a transition stage with the industry where the cable bundle is still kind of hanging on by a thread and it hasn't completely collapsed yet. Basically, what needs to happen is their sports need to be spun out of cable bundle, which is in the process of happening. And once that is, there
Hmm.
will be no real reason to subscribe to cable anymore. And then like
Yeah.
all those remaining users, like 50 million or so cable subscribers that are remaining, will then probably flood to all the streaming services, and that will cause a huge influx of money, and then maybe that'll make it easier for these all these streaming services to be profitable. But as of right now, all the streaming services are losing money other than Netflix finally started turning a profit, like a consistent profit within the last few years. But HBO Max, Disney Plus, like they're still losing hundreds of millions of dollars, upwards to $1 billion a quarter, because they're still having to like build that entire business from scratch. So
Yeah, I mean, I wonder,
the industry isn't super healthy right now.
yeah, I
Like
mean,
when
I remember reading. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
like when Sumner Redstone, who was the guy who started, or who basically combined Paramount and Viacom and CBS into one big mega company. When he died a few years ago, Paramount was worth like something like $20 billion or more, like its stock price
Hmm.
valuation, and it's now less. It's now worth less than 8 billion. And like Warner Brothers Discovery is now, just in the last year or two, is now worth half of what it was when those two companies merged. So they're all like having a very precipitous fall in terms of valuation, and they're struggling to recover from basically the dwindling of the lucrative cable bundle.
Well, yeah, like I remember reading an article a few years ago, and it was pretty much arguing in the was like we're in the golden age of content, or we're just kind of just getting ready to exit it. So like enjoy the fact that you have shows like Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad and things like that now, because at the same time as these companies are starting to struggle from produce, and like the budgets of these things are so huge. I mean, you get like YouTube, right? It's user generated content. Then you have people with like these massively popular channels, and YouTube doesn't have to do anything for that content except host it, right? So like entering possibly this kind of like DIY age of yeah, just YouTube thumbnail faces everywhere forever.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this phrase called ZIRP, and it stands for zero interest rate phenomena. And it's like it's
Okay.
given to any company that was completely propped up by there being zero interest rates, and therefore which equates to like basically free money, because it costs almost no money to loan loan to you because there wasn't a high interest rate. And so
Hmm.
all these streaming companies and all, and to what you're saying, like that huge influx of like super prestige content was a result not of because of profits that these companies were making, but because of a zero interest rate phenomena in which they could basically borrow money for free without any penalty.
Hmm.
So then, once inflation started kicking up and the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, suddenly it got a lot more expensive to borrow money. Wall Street started expecting these companies to actually turn a profit, and all that like free money is dried up, and that's why we are currently exiting that prestige era when there was just like so much dumb money being spent on so many TV shows, even though there wasn't that much of an audience for all of them.
Yeah, it's just fascinating though from a sort of, like, I guess like a like perspective gaining experience here. Like how you can get from kind of this tiny initial investment, and then success largely based on the novelty of being able to see boobs at home, then leads to like 30 years later, $8 million an episode of Game of Thrones shows, right? And this
I
sort
mean,
of
they were
like
spending by the end they
absolute,
were spending way more than $8 million an episode. It's
yeah.
now
I just know
becoming
it was like huge.
yeah, there are episodes of Stranger Things that cost $30 million per episode.
That's absolutely bonkers. That is insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I got a few more factoids before we sign off. So,
Okay.
like HBO recognized the threat from Netflix very early on. It was the only studio that, like, from the very beginning of the early streaming days, refused to license any of its shows to Netflix because it realized
Oh, right.
it
Yeah.
understood the threat. But like HBO could have competed with Netflix probably, but it was dragged kicking and screaming into streaming because it
Hmm.
had built such a great cash cow on top of the cable bundle that like there were like factions within HBO that were pushing for a pivot to streaming or to like to a more investment in streaming, but like none of the top brass wanted it because they didn't want because their profit margins were so high. I don't know if you remember this era, like when there was all these products like HBO Go and HBO Now. They were basically like these super shitty streaming products that you could only use if you had a cable subscription. Like you had to prove that you were a cable subscriber in order to use them.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know if you remember that. And like there were
Hmm.
like so many Games of Thrones fans that were just begging HBO to launch a streaming only subscription, but it basically just said no, fuck you, and refused to launch it until really I think HBO Max finally launched in what like 2019, 2020. So it was years later that it
Yeah.
finally launched like a standalone subscription. And as a result, Netflix had a huge head start. And then I guess the last thing to note is, now because Warner Media or Warner Brothers Discovery is in so much debt and is so desperate to make some money on extra money on its library content for the first time since in the history of Netflix, just in the last like 3 or 4 months, it now has the ability to license a few HBO shows. So for the first time in history, HBO shows are starting to show up on Netflix. So in that sense,
Oh, okay.
Netflix has probably won the war.
And they stand flag held high in the smoldering wreckage of HBO.
Yes.
As a
So the disruptor became the disrupted.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I got for you. What what
Yeah.
what, what are your thoughts? Do you have like a greater appreciation of HBO now than you ever did before?
I really do. I mean, just because I didn't really realize how much of the major developments in the kind of the history of TV, especially since like 1980, are results of innovations by HBO. I mean, the stand-up comedy special, and that was a thing that happened so gradually and became so ubiquitous that I didn't even notice they really weren't a thing in this way, especially not on like broadcast TV. And now it's like I feel like it's kind of weird if you don't watch stand-up comedy specials. Like people, and I'm not trying to be like the I don't even own a TV. I don't watch a lot of stand-up comedy, but like I feel like I probably am asked by people if I've seen the most recent so and so special more frequently than any other type of TV.
Yeah, and that was also part of Netflix's like as in its early days
Yeah.
original content, that it was shelling out a ton of money to like Dave Chappelle, Mike Birbiglia, all these comics, and it basically like took away the entire, it captured, it got like a monopoly for a few years on all the major stand-up comics because it was just shelling out so much money. I think like Chris Rock got paid like $20 million or something like that, or maybe it was Dave Chappelle,
Hmm.
which is more than any other comics ever been paid for a single stand-up special. So, like even today,
Yeah,
like streaming services are recognizing the power of the comedy special as like a pretty affordable way to get market share and get people talking about whatever it is you're producing.
yeah. And without, again, the added cost of writers or filming scenes or locations. It's
Yeah,
just you've got like a
or
two
special
camera setup
effects.
and a person is there. Yeah,
Yeah, my pleasure. I feel like I could do whole several other episodes about streaming and Netflix and stuff like that, but that'll be a different episode on a different day.
yeah, for sure.
So, what do you? So next week I'm going to be at a cabin on Sunday. So I don't know if we're going to like. I guess if since it's your turn to do the research, possibly you could do the research on Sunday and we record on Monday. Otherwise, we'll probably have to wait to the following week in order to record the next episode.
I mean, I'd still be good to go. It's gonna. I mean, I guess I could do the recording from the podcast platform and on here, and all you have to do is just sit there and listen and nod and sound impressed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it's always easier when I don't have to do the research. Do you have any
Yeah.
idea of what you're going to be talking about next week?
I do. I have a couple of ideas. I've been thinking about kind of this, the premise of what we're doing, which is that this is the age of anyone can become a momentary expert in an evening when they're like doing their like pre-bed scrolling on their phone and they fall down 3 Wikipedia holes in a row, and then the next day they're a momentary expert, right? So I've been thinking of a couple of stories that have grabbed my attention, largely because of their instances in which uh, we can't know something or it becomes hard to know, right? And we've become so accustomed to it that it becomes an obsession with people. um, and these involve sort of internet based mysteries, right? Which is a kind of a thing that we didn't really have for a long time, which was this ability to form a community of people who are all obsessed with discovering a thing. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about. The other thing that I was thinking about was and I mentioned it earlier, right? Because I accidentally signed into, or I accidentally went to YouTube when I was not signed in, right? And so it's not curated at all, and it's not trying to suggest things to me, and it's all YouTube thumbnail faces, right? Now I know YouTube thumbnail faces have been written about to death and to no end, right? Um, but I've been thinking about it in the context of what we were talking about last week, with sort of like the age of loneliness amidst the age of the internet, and I think there could be some interesting insights there. So I don't know which one of the two I'll pick, but I'll know by 3 hours before the next podcast and when I become a momentary expert on it.
Yeah, your topics are always more abstract and philosophical than mine. Mine's like, here's the history of prohibition, here's the history of HBO. You're like, why are people lonely?
Oh, so but that was, I mean, well, but if you're doing the history of prohibition or the history of HBO, you have a much less chance of just sort of rambling off into the stratosphere, which I feel like I do half the time,
Yeah,
which is
it does
just
allow me
run
to
up.
have like a certain level of structure. Although I was very I thought this would be an easy slam dunk, much easier than the prohibition episode. But
Mhm.
I got like three, my requisite 3 hours of research into this, and I like it felt like I had built up, I had bit off more than I could chew, and I didn't feel like I had a firm enough grasp to lecture about it over a prolonged period of time. Like like where I could connect all these dots together. But luckily, I think it sort of came together for me.
I thought you did great because yeah, I've got at least the broad strokes of kind of the the history of HBO, the transition from kind of scandalous, naughty content to like premiere television, and then kind of how that all ties in together with kind of the larger history of the medium up to and including the present day with streaming. So yeah, and I didn't have that an hour and 15 minutes ago. So good job, Simon.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. All right, man. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and get to work editing this. And hopefully, this will be up by the end of the night. Thanks, Craig.
Cool, buddy.